1. The Bith Sith Master. Long before Palpatine's empire cast its shadow across the galaxy, Darth Tenebrous worked in absolute secrecy. His name evokes darkness itself, and he represents one of the most intellectually terrifying Sith Lords in galactic history. Unlike rage-fueled warriors or power-hungry despots, Tenebrous approached the dark side with cold, mathematical precision. Born as Rugus Gnome, a Bith from the peaceful world of Clackdor 7, this being transformed from scientist to Sith Lord in ways that defied every expectation. The Bith species gave Tenebrous unique advantages. Their massive craniums housed brains capable of processing complex calculations instantaneously, perceiving multiple possible futures simultaneously, and understanding mathematical patterns in the Force itself. Where other Sith relied on passion and hatred, Tenebrous treated the dark side as an equation waiting to be solved. His large black eyes could perceive across multiple spectrums of light, seeing energies invisible to other beings. This biological edge, combined with his obsessive intellect, created a Sith Lord who viewed the Force not as mystical energy, but as a scientific phenomenon to be dissected, measured, and controlled. According to the Legends novel Darth Plagueis by James Luceno, Tenebrous operated during the final century of the Republic, approximately 100 years before the Battle of Yavin. He inherited the Sith legacy when the Order had abandoned open warfare, working instead through manipulation, patience, and orchestration of galactic events. Tenebrous embodied this philosophy perfectly, developing techniques that would influence Sith methodology for generations. His approach was clinical and utterly ruthless, in ways that made traditional Sith brutality seem almost compassionate by comparison. What made Tenebrous horrifying wasn't his capacity for violence, but his complete lack of sentiment regarding organic life. Living beings were variables in his equations, their suffering and death merely data points. This worldview would shape his apprentice's philosophy and contribute to techniques that made the Emperor's reign possible. But Tenebrous's genius led him down paths even other Sith considered forbidden. His obsession with understanding the Force's fundamental nature drove him to experiments that blurred the line between genius and madness. 2. Force Science. Weaponized. Tenebrous revolutionized how the Sith understood their own power. While Jedi viewed the Force as spiritual guidance, and most Sith saw it as raw energy to dominate, Tenebrous perceived a complex system governed by rules that could be decoded and exploited. He spent decades developing Sith Science, combining ancient dark-side teachings with cutting-edge mathematical analysis. His hidden laboratory contained instruments measuring Force energy, charting Midi-chlorian concentrations, and predicting future possibilities based on current Force patterns. His greatest contribution was refining Force visions into practical tools. Traditional Force users experienced visions as fleeting, unreliable glimpses clouded by symbolism. Tenebrous developed techniques to sharpen these into precise calculations. He could perceive branching timelines, calculate probability percentages for outcomes, and identify exact moments when intervention could alter destiny. This ability, the calculus of foresight, gave him unprecedented advantages in long-term planning. He could see consequences of actions decades before they occurred, orchestrating events with terrifying precision. Tenebrous also pioneered telekinesis applications that treated objects not as things to push or pull, but as components in larger systems. He perceived stress points in structures, understood energy flow through machines, and manipulated these systems with surgical accuracy. A single gesture could cause spacecraft engines to tear apart or buildings to collapse in precisely calculated patterns. This wasn't crude force crush employed by angry warriors. It was systematic deconstruction based on complete understanding. His knowledge extended to fields most Force users considered mundane. Tenebrous mastered astrophysics, quantum mechanics, and hyperspace theory, using this knowledge to develop dark-side techniques incorporating scientific principles. He created Force traps operating on quantum probability, existing in superposition until triggered by specific conditions. He developed meditation techniques allowing information processing at speeds overwhelming normal minds. Every aspect of his power was enhanced by scientific understanding. Yet tradition constrained him. The rule of two, established by Darth Bane a millennium earlier, meant only one apprentice. This frustrated him endlessly, as experiments required subjects and assistants. He began viewing the rule itself as an equation to solve, seeking ways to preserve Sith knowledge beyond the traditional master-apprentice chain. This obsession with transcending limitations led Tenebrous to his most ambitious project, achieving immortality through midi-chlorian manipulation itself. His experiments would push boundaries of what was thought possible with the Force. 3. Midi-chlorian manipulation mastery. Tenebrous's most controversial work centered on midi-chlorians, the microscopic organisms residing within cells that facilitate Force connection. While Jedi studied midi-chlorians to understand Force sensitivity, Tenebrous sought direct control, bending these organisms to his will to achieve what he considered ultimate power, life itself. His research built upon ancient Sith experiments, but approached the subject with scientific rigor that made previous attempts look primitive. Darth Plagueis reveals, Tenebrous developed techniques to manipulate midi-chlorian reproduction and distribution within living tissue. He discovered midi-chlorians weren't passive conduits but active participants that could be influenced through proper dark side application. By treating them as biological machines rather than mystical entities, he developed protocols temporarily enhancing Force sensitivity, extending lifespan, or even resurrecting recently deceased tissue. These weren't miracles but carefully executed medical procedures involving supernatural energy. His laboratory contained preserved specimens from dozens of species, each dissected to reveal how midi-chlorians interacted with different biological systems. Tenebrous documented findings with obsessive precision, creating vast databases cataloging midi-chlorian counts, distribution patterns, and responses to stimuli. He experimented with introducing artificial midi-chlorians into non-Force-sensitive beings, attempting to grant Force connection through scientific intervention. While experiments typically failed or produced unstable results, they provided invaluable data. Most disturbingly, Tenebrous used live subjects for extreme experiments. He captured beings from across the galaxy, studying how midi-chlorians responded when hosts suffered stress, torture, and eventual death. Screams from his laboratory weren't expressions of sadistic pleasure, but precise recordings of how suffering affected midi-chlorian behavior. He measured everything: heart rates, neural activity, Force energy fluctuations, midi-chlorian movement. Each death added data points to his grand equations. His ultimate goal was engineering a being whose midi-chlorians could be completely controlled, creating a vessel housing consciousness indefinitely. Success would allow transferring his essence into new bodies when his current form failed, achieving practical immortality without traditional Sith spirit possession techniques. The project consumed decades, requiring simultaneous advances in consciousness transfer, midi-chlorian manipulation, and biological preservation. Tenebrous also developed theoretical frameworks for creating life entirely from midi-chlorians, manipulating them to spontaneously generate conscious beings. This research would later influence his apprentice's own experiments, ultimately leading to attempts shaking the Force's very foundations. While Tenebrous pursued these forbidden sciences in isolation, he recognized the necessity of maintaining Sith tradition by taking an apprentice. His choice would prove fateful, as his selection possessed ambitions rivaling his own, and patience ultimately exceeding his master's calculations. 4. Training Darth Plagueis. The relationship between Tenebrous and his apprentice Plagueis represented a fascinating collision of two scientific minds pursuing the same goals through different methodologies. Tenebrous selected a moon named Hago Damask, recognizing in this banker's son the rare combination of Force sensitivity, intellectual brilliance, and ruthless pragmatism necessary for Sith greatness. The moon species, known for financial acumen and strategic thinking, brought complementary skills to Tenebrous's pure scientific approach. Where Tenebrous saw equations, Plagueis would eventually see opportunities for manipulation through economic and political channels. According to Darth Plagueis, Tenebrous's training methods were brutal but never random. Every lesson served calculated purpose, every trial designed to push his apprentice toward specific realizations about the Force's nature. He taught Plagueis to view the galaxy as a vast machine where every component, from individual beings to entire civilizations, could be understood through cause and effect. Traditional Sith passion was permitted, but only as fuel for logical action, never as an end. Tenebrous demanded Plagueis approach every problem systematically, breaking complex situations into solvable components. The Master shared research on Midi-chlorian manipulation, though he withheld critical findings. This was standard Sith practice. Masters never revealed everything to apprentices. Maintaining knowledge advantages necessary should betrayal occur. Tenebrous taught Plagueis basic principles of influencing midi-chlorians, demonstrating techniques for extending life and preventing death in simple organisms. However, he withheld advanced work on consciousness transfer and theoretical frameworks for creating life. These secrets, Tenebrous believed, would die with him or transfer to a new vessel. Tenebrous also trained Plagueis in his unique approach to Force visions. The Moon proved naturally gifted, his species' inherent risk assessment ability combining with Force sensitivity to produce remarkably accurate predictions. Master and apprentice spent hours in meditation, perceiving possible futures and discussing probability percentages. Tenebrous pushed Plagueis to identify critical junctures where small actions could cascade into massive consequences. This training would later enable Plagueis to orchestrate events across decades, ultimately leading to the Republic's fall. The relationship was never warm. Tenebrous viewed Plagueis as a tool, albeit valuable, while Plagueis recognized his master's detachment and planned accordingly. Both understood Sith apprentices were expected to eventually surpass and kill their masters. This fundamental progression ensured each generation grew stronger. Tenebrous accepted this intellectually but worked to subvert it through immortality research. If he achieved consciousness transfer, the rule of two would become meaningless. Tension grew as Plagueis' power increased. Tenebrous began perceiving troubling futures where his apprentice succeeded in ways threatening his plans. These visions disturbed him because they suggested variables he hadn't controlled, possibilities he hadn't calculated. For a being who prided himself on predicting and controlling outcomes, this uncertainty represented fundamental failure. This tension would reach its breaking point during a routine mission that Tenebrous' visions assured him was safe. But even sophisticated calculations cannot account for every variable, and fate would prove more unpredictable than mathematics suggested. 5. The Cortosis catastrophe. The mission to Baldemnik should have been routine. Tenebrous and Plagueis traveled there to investigate Cortosis deposits, a rare ore that could short out lightsabers and potentially enhance certain dark side techniques. According to Darth Plagueis, Tenebrous' calculations indicated minimal risk, his Force visions showing successful acquisition and safe return. His mathematical approach to Foresight had never failed before. This overconfidence would prove fatal. The mining facility was ancient and poorly maintained, its structural integrity compromised by decades of inadequate oversight. Tenebrous' analytical mind should have recognized danger signs, but focus on Cortosis samples distracted him from assessing the facility itself. He was so absorbed in calculating how to use the Cortosis in experiments that he failed to calculate whether the building around him would hold. For a being who prided himself on seeing every variable, this represented catastrophic oversight. The collapse came without warning. Support beams gave way, sending tons of rock and metal crashing down. Plagueis, younger and more physically agile, created a force barrier protecting him from the worst damage. Tenebrous, caught off guard and positioned unfavorably, took the full brunt. His Bith body, evolved for intellectual pursuits rather than physical resilience, shattered under impact. The great scientific mind that had unlocked so many secrets found itself trapped in a dying shell of flesh and bone. As his body failed, Tenebrous experienced something he'd spent decades trying to prevent: uncontrolled death. His carefully constructed plans for consciousness transfer required preparation, specific conditions, and willing vessels. He had none of these. Instead, he faced extinction in its rawest form, complete cessation terrifying even to Sith Lords. His vast knowledge, decades of research, understanding of the Force's deepest mysteries, all threatened to die with him in this collapsed mind. But Tenebrous refused to accept defeat, even in death. As his body's final moments approached, He attempted something desperate and improvised, using techniques he'd developed but never properly tested. He tried transferring his consciousness into the only available vessel, his apprentice Plagueis. The attempt was rushed, imperfect, lacking preparation his calculations deemed necessary. Yet he had no choice. It was this crude transfer or complete oblivion, and Tenebrous's ego could not accept erasure. The transfer appeared initially successful. Tenebrous felt his consciousness slip into Plagueis' mind, riding alongside his apprentice's awareness like a passenger in a vehicle. He survived, after a fashion, though not as envisioned. Traditional Sith passion was permitted, but only as fuel for logical action, never as an end. Tenebrous demanded Plagueis approach every problem systematically, breaking complex situations into solvable components. The Master shared research on Midi-chlorian manipulation, though he withheld critical findings. This wasn't the complete possession he'd planned, where his consciousness would dominate a new body entirely. Instead, he existed as a fractured presence, aware but limited, watching through another's eyes without power to control. What Tenebrous discovered in this state of half-death was far more horrifying than simple extinction. He became trapped in a prison of consciousness, able to observe but unable to act, watching helplessly as his carefully laid plans unraveled around him. 6. Consciousness trapped forever. Tenebrous's existence as a consciousness fragment within Plagueis' mind represented a hell specifically tailored for a being of his nature. He remained aware, able to think and observe, but completely unable to influence events or communicate his presence. For a Sith Lord who had dedicated his life to controlling every variable, this powerless state was torture beyond physical suffering. He could see through Plagueis' eyes, hear through his ears, and access some thoughts, yet he was merely a passenger in his own apprentice's mind, invisible and irrelevant. According to Darth Plagueis, Tenebrous quickly realized the fundamental flaw in his improvised consciousness transfer. Without proper preparation, without the specific midi-chlorian manipulation techniques he'd developed but never perfected, he couldn't establish dominance over his host. Plagueis' consciousness was too strong, too firmly entrenched. The moon's mind was like a fortress Tenebrous could observe from within but never capture. He existed in gaps between thoughts, a ghost haunting his former apprentice's awareness. The psychological torment intensified as Tenebrous watched Plagueis methodically dismantle everything his master had built. The moon showed no reverence for Tenebrous's research, no interest in continuing his specific methodologies. Instead, Plagueis took fundamental principles and developed them in entirely new directions. He approached midi-chlorian manipulation differently, incorporating financial manipulation and political strategy in ways Tenebrous never considered. The Master could only watch, screaming silently as his life's work transformed into something unrecognizable. Worse still, Tenebrous could perceive futures Plagueis couldn't see. His superior facility with force visions remained intact even in his fragmentary state, allowing him to calculate outcomes with characteristic precision. He saw dangers Plagueis would face, mistakes his apprentice would make, and the ultimate fate awaiting them both. He could see the young slave from Tatooine who would one day destroy everything, could calculate probabilities of the Sith's grand plan succeeding or failing. Yet he possessed no means to communicate these insights, no way to warn or guide or intervene. The fragment of Tenebrous lingered for years, possibly decades, trapped in aware impotence. Some sources suggest he eventually faded, his consciousness finally dissipating as midi-chlorians sustaining him degraded without proper maintenance. Others propose he remained present until Plagueis' own death, experiencing his apprentice's murder at Palpatine's hands as final indignity. In either case, Tenebrous's desperate grab for immortality resulted in prolonged experience of futility and helplessness, proving some fates are worse than simple death. His failure offered a dark lesson about the limits of Sith knowledge. For all his genius, all his scientific understanding of the Force, Tenebrous couldn't overcome the fundamental truth that consciousness transfer required more than intellectual understanding. It required preparation, proper vessels, and probably factors he'd never discovered. His mathematical approach to the Force had failed to account for the one variable that mattered most: the unpredictable nature of existence itself. Despite his personal failure, Tenebrous's work would echo through Sith history, influencing events in ways he never anticipated. His research, inherited and modified by Plagueis, would ultimately contribute to the rise of the most powerful Sith Empire the galaxy had ever seen. 7. Tenebrous's enduring legacy. Though Tenebrous failed to achieve his personal goals, his influence on galactic history cannot be understated. The scientific approach to the Force that he pioneered became foundational to the final Sith plot that destroyed the Jedi Order and the Republic. Plagueis inherited Tenebrous's research and expanded it, developing techniques enabling Chosen One prophecy manipulation and Midi-chlorian corruption. While Plagueis deserves credit for his own innovations, the groundwork came from his master's obsessive documentation and experimentation. The most significant legacy was Tenebrous's methodology itself. By treating the Force as science rather than mysticism, he opened pathways previous Sith Lords never imagined. His techniques for Midi-chlorian manipulation, refined by Plagueis, eventually influenced how Palpatine understood the dark side. The Emperor's famous statement that the dark side was a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural echoed Tenebrous's fundamental philosophy. The Force follows rules, and those rules can be exploited. Every dark side technique Palpatine employed, from his longevity to his ability to hide his presence from the Jedi, built upon foundations Tenebrous established. His work on Force visions and probability calculation also shaped Sith strategy during the Clone Wars and the Empire's rise. The ability to perceive multiple futures and calculate optimal intervention points allowed Palpatine to orchestrate events across decades, positioning pieces precisely where they needed to be. Tenebrous had taught Plagueis these techniques, and Plagueis passed modified versions to Sidious. The Emperor's seemingly supernatural ability to predict his enemy's actions and plan accordingly wasn't just Force sensitivity. It was applied mathematics taught by a Bith scientist a century earlier. Interestingly, Tenebrous's failures also taught valuable lessons. Plagueis observed his master's botched consciousness transfer and understood the technique's limitations. This awareness made Plagueis approach his own immortality research differently, focusing on preventing death rather than transferring consciousness. While Plagueis ultimately failed as well, his adjusted methodology based on Tenebrous's mistakes represented progress. Similarly, Palpatine learned from both their failures, developing contingencies like clone bodies and dark side artifacts to preserve himself after death. Beyond specific techniques, Tenebrous established a philosophical framework that defined late-era Sith thinking. The cold, calculated approach to domination, the patient manipulation of systems rather than direct confrontation, the willingness to sacrifice anything for long-term advantage. These characteristics marked the Sith Lords who brought down the Republic. They operated like Tenebrous thought, viewing the galaxy as a complex equation solvable through sufficient analysis and ruthless application of force at critical junctures. Even Tenebrous's research materials survived him. Plagueis preserved many of his master's notes and experimental data, storing them in secret archives. Some of this information may have passed to Palpatine, contributing to Imperial projects and dark side research during the Empire's reign. The exact extent of Tenebrous's documented knowledge that survived remains unclear, but the systematic, thorough nature of his work suggests he left behind comprehensive records that could inspire or inform dark side practitioners for generations. Understanding Tenebrous's true story requires acknowledging the complications of Star Wars continuity, particularly the division between canon and Legends material. The character exists differently in each timeline, with vastly different amounts of information available depending on which continuity we examine. 8. Canon versus Legends. The complicated nature of Star Wars continuity means Tenebrous exists in two forms, with dramatically different amounts of detail depending on which timeline we're discussing. In current Disney canon, established after Lucasfilm's 2014 continuity reset, Tenebrous is barely more than a name. Canon sources confirm his existence as Darth Plagueis' master, establishing him as part of the Sith lineage leading to Palpatine. The reference book Star Wars: The Secrets of the Sith mentions Tenebrous as Plagueis' predecessor, but provides no additional details about his species, abilities, or fate. This canonical restraint leaves Tenebrous as a mysterious figure whose story remains largely untold. Canon sources haven't specified whether he was a Bith, haven't described his scientific approach to the Force, and haven't mentioned his failed consciousness transfer. For strict canon adherence, Tenebrous is simply Plagueis' master who presumably trained him in dark side techniques before dying under unknown circumstances. This limited information reflects Disney's approach to the Sith lineage, focusing storytelling attention on characters who appear in films and major shows rather than exploring earlier generations. In contrast, Legends continuity provides the comprehensive portrait discussed in previous sections. The 2012 novel Darth Plagueis by James Luceno remains the definitive source for Tenebrous' character, offering detailed information about his life, research, and death. This novel, written before the continuity reset, was extensively researched and carefully integrated into the broader Legends timeline. Luceno's portrayal of Tenebrous as a Bith scientist who approached the Force through mathematics and experimentation became canon within Legends, shaping how fans understood the Sith lineage that preceded Palpatine. The Legends version draws additional support from other sources within that continuity. Book of Sith: Secrets from the Dark Side, also published before 2014, provides context for Sith philosophy during Tenebrous' era, including references to scientific approaches some Sith Lords employed. The Darth Bane trilogy established the rule of two background governing Tenebrous' relationship with Plagueis, while various reference books provided additional details about Bith biology and capabilities that inform understanding of Tenebrous' advantages and limitations. For fans trying to navigate this split, the key distinction is simple. If you want comprehensive information about Tenebrous as a character, you must turn to Legends material. If you strictly adhere to Disney canon, you can only confirm his existence and position in the Sith lineage. The detailed story of the Bith Sith scientist, his experiments with Midi-chlorians, his relationship with Plagueis, and his failed consciousness transfer all exist only in Legends continuity. This doesn't make the Legends story less interesting or valuable. It simply means current official Star Wars storytelling hasn't chosen to incorporate these details. The possibility remains that future canon works could reintroduce elements of Tenebrous' Legends characterization, potentially reimagining him for current continuity. Star Wars has shown willingness to bring Legends concepts into canon when they serve story purposes, as seen with characters like Thrawn, who were reintroduced with modified backgrounds. Until such developments occur, however, fans must understand that discussions of Tenebrous' scientific genius, his experiments, and his horrific fate refer to Legends material rather than current canon. This continuity split highlights broader tension in Star Wars fandom between comprehensive storytelling and streamlined canon. Legends offered decades of interconnected stories that built a rich, complex universe filled with characters like Tenebrous. Canon prioritizes accessibility and creative freedom for new stories, sometimes at the expense of depth in areas peripheral to main narratives. For Tenebrous specifically, this means his horrifying true story exists primarily in Legends, waiting to be rediscovered by fans willing to explore that timeline.